Former South African President Nelson Mandela recently announced he's retiring from public life. Mandela will not be among the foreign dignitaries attending services for Ronald Reagan. After all, he was languishing in a South African prison throughout the duration of the Reagan presidency. This history has been effectively rewritten in the United States. The dominant view is that the U.S. was on the right side of South Africa, that it opposed apartheid. But nothing could be further from the truth, particularly when Reagan was president. Reagan labeled Mandela's African National Congress a notorious terrorist organization while continuing Washington's support for the apartheid regime. In '81, President Reagan explained to CBS he was loyal to the South African regime because it was, quote, a country that has stood by us in every war we've ever fought, a country that strategically is essential to the free world in its production of minerals. But even as the majority of the American people came to oppose South Africa's apartheid regime, President Reagan stood by his friend. African American leaders and organizations pressured Congress to take action, ultimately passed sanctions against South Africa. True to form, Reagan vetoed the bill. But to Reagan's shame, Congress overrode that veto. Today we're going to look at Reagan's support for apartheid South Africa with one of the victims of the regime, Father Michael Lapsley. In 1990, 3 months after the release of Nelson Mandela from prison, the de Klerk government sent Father Lapsley a package containing 2 magazines. Inside one of them, a highly sophisticated bomb. When Lapsley opened the magazine, the explosion brought down the ceilings in the house, blew a hole in the floors, shattered windows. It also blew off both of Father Michael Lapsley's hands, blew out one of his eyes, burned him severely. He flew in from South Africa last night and joins us now in our Firehouse studio. Welcome to Democracy Now!
Thank you, Amy. Great to be here again.
How did you survive? Most people did not think you were alive after you opened that magazine.
Well, I think it was a miracle to survive. Clearly, it was a bomb that was supposed to kill, not simply to damage. I suppose in a way it was my faith saw me through, and somehow I experienced God being with me in that experience of being bombed. But of course it was a long journey personally towards healing and wholeness, coming to terms with having no hands.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to talk to you about those years as we wrap up our week of remembering the dead, as we look at the history of the Reagan years. And then to end by talking about restorative justice, an issue that you take around the world. Can you talk about those years, 1981 to 1989 in South Africa?
Yes, I think it's good to think about what South Africa was like inside the country as well as what was happening in the frontline states at that time. During those years, there were 2 states of emergency. Vast numbers of people were imprisoned. It was during those years, and this is a salient point for people in this country this time, torture became normative. It became a principal weapon used by the apartheid regime against people, particularly against black children during that period. It was also a period where there were a vast number of people on death row in South Africa. Every Thursday, up to 7 people at a time were executed. But it was also a time when the apartheid regime was on the rampage in the frontline states, attacking Botswana, Lesotho, Mozambique, Zimbabwe. There were a number of massacres of refugees that took place. It was also a time of civil war in Angola, and it was the Reagan administration that was supporting UNITA bandits in Angola and fomenting war. And it was very clear to the people of South Africa during those years that whilst there were a vast number of ordinary people in the United States, particularly African Americans who stood with us, the Reagan administration was on the side of apartheid. And it was both Reagan and Thatcher who were giving succor to the apartheid regime, and in a sense prolonging our struggle. More people had to die in South Africa because of the support that came from Western governments, particularly from Washington and London at that period.
What about this quote of former President Reagan talking about the apartheid regime as, quote, a country that stood by us in every war we've ever fought, a country that strategically is essential to the free world in its production of minerals.
I think the interesting thing about that comment is it focuses on profit. It doesn't focus on what happens to people. And of course, remembering that regime that Reagan was supporting was a regime in which the majority of the people were voteless. The majority of the people had no legitimate way of removing an illegitimate regime.
This was the time in the United States and its policy towards South Africa of the term coined constructive engagement.
Yeah, sure. And it was constructive for death. That's the real point. It was not constructive with the people of South Africa who were living and dying for basic fundamental human rights, rights that people all over the world take for granted, that we had to die in great numbers to achieve, simply the right to go to the polls, to choose a government for ourselves.
What difference did it make what role the U.S. played within South Africa or in the frontline states?
Well, the African National Congress of South Africa, leading the struggle in South Africa, was saying to the world, we will free South Africa. We ask the world to be in solidarity with us. So the role the international community had to play was to shorten that struggle, to mean that we would die less. And so in a way, the support, the economic support to apartheid meant the struggle lasted longer. It took us longer to achieve those fundamental rights, to achieve democratic freedoms.
You focus on restorative justice. Before I talk about that, have you ever learned who it was that put this, was it plastique in the magazine?
It was some kind of substance, certainly, that caused that explosion. I don't know who individually was responsible. I know that de Klerk was politically and morally responsible.
Where were you when this happened?
I was in Harare in Zimbabwe. The point was the death squads, even though negotiations were about to begin, they were still in operation. And the apartheid regime said, we'll talk, but they were still killing at night. And so it was in that context that this letter bomb went off. And it's also worth saying that, yes, I was a militant of the African National Congress, but you know, the only automatic weapon I've ever used in my life was the one I'm using now, my tongue. And the regime in their stupidity took away my hands, which I didn't need to shoot, and left my weapon working reasonably well.
How long did it take you to recover?
I was in hospital for about 7 months. That's the kind of the physical journey, but there's another kind of journey of coming to terms with having no hands. But I was very fortunate in that my pain and what happened to me was acknowledged, reverenced, and recognized by people around the world, and that enabled me to travel a journey from victim to survivor to victor. And that's in a way why I do the work I do now, to seek to walk beside others who have not had their pain acknowledged. And I think one of the very wonderful things you are doing in this program today is not simply acknowledging Reagan, everybody's doing that, but you're acknowledging the poor of the world who suffered under Reagan, and this great knowledge of what happened to unemployed, poor, homeless, African American, Hispanic people. But by this very program, we are moving from knowledge to acknowledgement. And I think that in itself is one step on the journey to healing, acknowledging what happened to the ordinary people in those years and lifting up their stories, their pain, but also their faith and endurance and hope and commitment, and giving it its rightful place at this time.
We spent the week, or we spoke with Noam Chomsky about Central America policy, Alan Nairn about what happened in Guatemala, the investigative journalist, about the more than 100,000 Guatemalans who died during this period of the 80s with the U.S. supporting the successive military regimes. We spoke with Father Miguel de Escoto, the former foreign minister of Nicaragua, about the thousands of Nicaraguans who died, U.S. supporting
the
Contras, and talked about El Salvador, the tens of thousands of Salvadoran civilians who died there.
That's part of acknowledgement, and that's part of the journey to healing. So those stories are not forgotten, but the individual lives are recognized.
You are part of the whole truth and reconciliation process in South Africa led by Bishop Tutu. Did you testify before the commission?
Yes, I gave evidence to the commission, and whilst I had told my story many times, speaking to the commission had a very particular moral significance, because in a way I felt that my own story was becoming an indelible part of that great patchwork of the journey of the people of South Africa. And in a way, I would say, although I lost hands that I'll always grieve for, the greatest privilege of my life was to be part of perhaps the most important struggle of the 20th century, the struggle against apartheid.
What do you mean by restorative justice?
Well, it's interesting, when we say the word justice, in most countries, especially the United States, people mean retribution, or in fact sometimes they mean revenge. Restorative justice asks a different kind of question. It doesn't say, how can the state punish the offender? It says, how can we restore the relationships that have been broken? And of course, in a country where you have 2 million of your citizens in prison, that's retributive justice at its worst, and of course the rampant use of the death penalty. But restorative justice seeks to restore relationships that have been broken. It seeks to provide opportunities where victim and offender can meet each other, and people can explore the journey they need to travel to make it up to those who have hurt. So, for example, for me, if I met the person who had sent me the letter bomb, and they asked for my forgiveness, I would be happy to forgive them, and I would prefer they spent their lives, for example, working in a hospital rather than be locked up in prison. But I might say to them, of course, you would also be willing to help assist me with my needs for the rest of my life as a form of restorative justice, a form of making it up in the ways that are possible. So that's what I think I mean by restorative justice, which is a justice that gives hope, where often retributive justice simply continues cycles where victims become victimizers.
Steve Biko, the founder of the Black Consciousness Movement, who, well, on another September 11th, 1977, was being beaten to death by U.S.-backed apartheid forces, died in the early hours of September 12th, 1977, father of the Black Consciousness Movement. His family did not support just the idea of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that if people came forward and they revealed what they had done, who was involved with Steve Biko's death, that would be enough, that they should be granted amnesty.
I think, I know, of course, Nati Biko, Steve's son, they were not opposed to the Truth Commission. They supported the Truth Commission, but they had very specific opposition to amnesty because they said it would violate their right to a form of justice. The response of our Constitutional Court was to say, however, that if there were reparations, there would be a form of restorative justice, and that was in fact what won the day. But of course, amnesty is a bitter pill to swallow, but the alternative to amnesty in the South African context was an escalating civil war that would have taken millions of lives. So we did make a compromise, but it's a compromise that opened a democratic space for us to be able to now struggle to create a more just society.
We've been speaking with Father Michael Lapsley, director of the Institute for Healing of Memories. If people want to get in touch with you, where can they write?
The www, healing of memories, one word, .co.za, healingofmemories.co.za, or our email address, healing@mindspring.co.za, healing@mindspring.co.za.
And for those of you who might not get to that last part, that's healing at mindspring.co.za.
I'm learning to speak American.
Learning our impediment. Thank you very much, Father Michael Lapsley.